Now let's drain the coolant. There's the drain plug right there. Use some pliers, grab onto the drain plug, turn it counterclockwise to loosen it up. Let your coolant drain. Open the overflow cap. That'll let the coolant system breathe as it drains. Now make sure the radiator petcock is fully closed. Let's move this clamp out of the way just because it's in the way of the lower bolt for this thermostat housing. So I'm just gonna take it and spin it upwards a little bit. Sometimes you can even use a tool and kind of pry up on this and it'll spin slowly, just like that. That should be plenty of room for us to get to that lower bolt. Two 10mm bolts. I have a long extension that I can break these free with. And once those are broken free, I'm just going to go ahead and remove them the rest of the way and get this piece out of the way. Now, no matter how much you drain your coolant, there's still going to be coolant stuck in there, so have a collection bucket ready. Take those bolts out. Now you can pull the thermostat housing off. Set it to the side like that. And here's your thermostat. Pull this out. I'm going to take a screwdriver and just scrape a little bit of this debris off of here so that I can make or provide a clean sealing surface for the new thermostat. You can also use a razor blade if you prefer to use that, but the way that this is positioned here, a screwdriver will do the job just fine. And it doesn't have to be 100% perfect, just get off the majority of the stuff that's in there. There we go. I'm going to use a long screwdriver to help pry away the locking tab for the electrical connector. And then I'm going to gently pull on the back side. There we go. Unplug that. Now let's grab a socket and take that out. Use a 19mm socket, break the sensor free, and just remove it the rest of the way. There it is. Now we have to take off the rest of the thermostat housing, and from behind it, I'm looking through a mirror, or, well, you're looking through a mirror. I'm looking straight down at it, but three 10mm bolts is what holds this onto the engine block. So I'm gonna go ahead and break these free. They're not very tight. And once I break it free, I'm just gonna go ahead and remove it the rest of the way. That way I know it's out of my way. This one's extra long, keep that in mind. Now you can just pull the thermostat housing off. It does have a pipe that is attached to it, and this is the point of us removing this. We need to get this pipe off of the water pump. So slide this whole housing assembly towards the driver's side. Get every wire out of the way. As you slide it towards the driver's side, give it a little wiggle like this, and the pipe should pop out of the water pump. Coolant will still come out of it. There's coolant everywhere, no matter how much you drain the system. There we go. Now on the passenger side of the engine, you'll notice that here's the water pump, the other end of it right here. I did remove the air box. You don't have to. It was just for camera purposes. But you have to take this little cap off, held on with 4 10mm bolts, so we can access more hardware that's behind it to remove the water pump. So just go ahead and back these off and remove them all the way. Okay. Next, you'll need this special tool that holds the sprocket for the water pump for you. Since it's timing chain driven, you don't want to just take out the bolts for the sprocket to the water pump without holding it. Otherwise, you will just make your timing chain fall out into the timing chain cover. So you need this tool to hold everything in place. So I'm going to slide this down right into where we took out the cover earlier. And so the sprocket will have some threaded holes that this will line up with. I got this one to start into one of them. I'm just going to go ahead and bottom it out and then line this one up as well. This one started, bottom them out, and then I'm going to snug them. And then you want to bolt this adapter tool to the timing chain housing so that it's held in place nice and tight. I'm going to use my 10mm socket to snug this up. Don't make it tight, just snug so it doesn't fall off by itself. Perfect, just like that. Now take two of your bolts that you just took out off of the housing or that plate cover. Thread those back in. There's one. And with both of those in, I'm going to go ahead and snug both of these. You don't want this tool to move. That would be bad. You would lose tension on the timing chain, and you have to retime the engine otherwise. So just make sure everything is snug. Perfect. And now I'll use a deep socket so I can get in there, or a small extension. And now you can loosen up the 3 bolts that hold that sprocket to the water pump. So there's one bolt that should line up with that hole in the center. Break that free, just like that. I'm going to break them all free, and then I'm going to take them out by hand because I also want to have a magnet in there that will catch the bolt in case it accidentally falls down. You definitely don't want any of these to fall down. Okay, they're all broken free. Let's grab a magnet. I'm going to use my magnet, stick it in there so I can catch the bolt. Okay, there's one bolt. Be super careful with these. If you have a magnetized socket of some sort, that would be the best. There's the second bolt. Now for this last one, I'm going to unthread it all the way. Okay, it's skipping on the last thread. I'm going to stick my magnet onto my socket. That's going to make my socket magnetic to some extent. Not very strong, but enough to where I can pull this bolt out safely. Be very gentle. So now we need to take out 2 more bolts from the front here in order to free up the water pump from this side. Then we'll have to move to the back side and take out some more bolts. But there's this one up top here, not to be confused with that one. This one just holds the timing chain cover in. This is the one that you need to remove. This goes all the way through. It's a long bolt, and this basically holds the water pump. I'm going to use my 13mm socket and just break this one free. All right, this one's free. I'm gonna go ahead and remove it. Let's break free the lower one, which is straight down right underneath our tool, actually. Very hard to see, but not that hard to reach. Right here. Break it free. And these are pretty tight for what they are. Once it's broken free with my 3/8, I'll switch to my 1/4 inch so I can remove it easier. Now from the back side of the water pump, I'm going to take this wire off of here so it can be out of our way. Move it to the side. And then there are 2 13mm bolts that we have to unbolt, not to be confused with these 10mm that go all around. Those are for the cover to the water pump, which we'll have to remove later. For now, only break free these bolts over here. There's one up top, the one that I'm on right now. break it free and remove it. Okay, set that aside. And then there's one lower, which is this one over here. Break this one free. Let's remove that one as well. Take that out, set it aside. I'm going to take a little rubber mallet and just tap on the water pump. There we go. It was just stuck on there. And pull it up and out. Now we have the old water pump here, and we have to take this cover off and transfer it to the new one. And it's just held on with a bunch of 10mm bolts. And just as a side note, this right here is actually a drain bolt, 13mm socket. You could have drained the coolant through here for the water pump if you wanted to. No matter what you do though, it's still going to make a mess everywhere, so that's why I didn't open it. So let's just take all of these bolts out. Whoa. Okay, remember that the stud goes on the bottom there. The rest of them are the same type of bolts. Get this off. Use a little pry bar. Pry it. Okay. There's a gasket here. Remove the gasket. Comes with a new one. You should always replace these. Now we want to clean up this surface, make sure it's good. And there are two dowel pins. One is up here. The water pump comes with two new ones, so I'm just going to take these out and reuse or install my new ones. And the other one stayed inside of the water pump, so I'm just going to leave it here. So now let's clean up the surface to make sure that it's ready for the new gasket. Wipe it off. I'm going to use a little bit of brake parts cleaner to make sure this groove here is nice and free of any debris and oils from the coolant. I'm going to run my rag through it. You definitely don't want any coolant leaks here. Okay, the rest of the water pump you don't have to clean very well because it's just coolant and it's going to fill up with coolant the second you fill it up, so don't worry about that. Just make sure the mounting surface is clean. Now let's take the new gasket, slide this on, make sure it fits into the groove, just like so. Perfect. Let's transfer it over to the new one. However, before we put it on, don't forget about the two dowel pins, one here and one here. This just helps you line it all up so that you know it's perfectly centered. Make sure the gasket stays on here as you put the two together, just like that. The stud went down here, and the rest was held on by bolts. So I'm going to bottom them out by hand, at least two of them, the way the cover doesn't fall off when I let go. And if that happens, the gasket will most likely fall out of place, and then you want to check it, because if you tighten this all up with the gasket out of place, well, you're going to notice a severe leak. So that's not good. So let's bottom these out. And then we'll actually go ahead and torque these. Since there is a gasket here that seals it up from coolant, it's important to have it properly tightened. All right, let's torque it. 89 inch-pounds for all of these bolts. I'm going to torque them in a cross pattern. That way this can seat properly and make sure that there are no leaks. I'm going to start here. Just double check them all now. It's kind of awkward when you have to hold it like this, but do the best you can. And if you don't have a torque wrench that goes this low, just take a 1/4 inch ratchet and make them tight. On the front side of the water pump, there's another O-ring gasket that we have to put on. Slide it into place, make sure it's seated. You don't want this to fall out as you're putting the water pump back on. because if the gasket gets pinched, then obviously it's not going to seal up. So you definitely want to make sure that it stays in here. It should kind of, sort of snap into place and be held on. Even when you put it upside down, it shouldn't fall out. So now we can install the new water pump into the vehicle. So you don't have to take this crossover tube out. I did, just to make things easier, but usually you would just push it back and out of the way. This also makes it easier for me to show you how to replace this O-ring, otherwise it'll be difficult down there. Your water pump should come with a new one. Since you have to remove this from the water pump, you always want to replace it. I'm also going to replace the O-ring on the other side since I took it out. But basically you want to take the old one off, take the new one before you put it on. Make sure you have a clean surface. If this is corroded, you want to clean it, and if it's really pitted and corroded, you definitely want to get a new crossover tube. And then you take your new O-ring and simply slide it over. Make sure it's seated into place. Make sure it doesn't fall off. And now you do the same thing to the other side if you removed it. If you don't remove it from the thermostat housing, you definitely don't have to do anything here, as long as that one's still good. Now we can go ahead and put this back. Before you install the new water pump, make sure that this mounting surface is clean. In my case, it is pretty clean, so I'm just going to take a rag, remove any debris that might be on here, so that I have the best chance of sealing up. If it's corroded, you want to take a razor blade to it. Like I said, not the case for me. So, take your new water pump, slide it down into position, and line it up. There we go. I'm going to start the two bolts back here. There's one. And one on the bottom. Now I'm going to thread in the two front bolts. Now before we completely torque these bolts, I put a long mirror so I can see through the hole in the front here, through the timing chain cover, and I'm looking to line up the sprocket that is driven by the timing chain that bolts up to the water pump with the pulley on the water pump. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to pull the water pump back. So the bolts are all in, all four 13 millimeter bolts are in, but they're not tight yet. I can wiggle this in and out, pull it out, and then I'm going to go through the tube here on the back where the crossover tube sits, and I'm going to spin the water pump, and I'm going to look with this mirror to make sure that I line up all of the threaded holes with the mounting holes on the sprocket. Like right here is actually perfect. So I'm going to leave it like this, and now I can press the water pump in, thread on the bolts, and torque them. 18 foot-pounds is the torque for all of these. I had to resort to a small 1/4-inch torque wrench to do the torquing on the back side. And like I said, 18 foot-pounds is the torque. That's it right there for this one. I'm going to go ahead and torque this bottom one while I'm at it. Okay, that's it for that one. While I'm here, I'm just going to go ahead and put the wire back on the stud. Someone has secured it with a wire tie in the past. That's all that is here to secure it. So I'm going to put it back. And then on the front, I can use my bigger torque wrench and do 18 foot-pounds for both of these front bolts. All right, the other one is all the way down there. All right, that's it. We'll double check them. Yep. Now it's time to get the bolts in that lock in the sprocket onto the water pump. I'm going to use the same method of magnetizing my socket with my magnet. I'm going to start with this lower bolt that goes in through the tool here, and I'm going to thread it in by hand. Of course, you definitely do not want these to cross thread. I'm going to drive it in a few threads. I'm not going to tighten it yet, just in case things need to shift around a little bit, but oops, made it a little too snug. Okay, leave it like that. Let's put in the other two the same exact way. All right, I got the second one in. Let's get the third one in. That's the last one. I use a mirror to help find the threads. Right there. This is not the easiest thing to do, and like I mentioned before, for disassembly, you definitely do not want these falling in there. Okay, that one's tight. Let's bottom this one. Well, it's not tight, it's just bottomed out. Bottom out this one, and this one. All right, let's give them a little snug, and then you can torque these to 89 inch-pounds. That's 1, 2, 3. Okay, and now we can remove the holding tool. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to loosen up the two bolts that bolted up to the housing first. All right, and with those loosened up, I'm going to loosen up the two bolts that bolt it to the sprocket. Now I should be able to just remove all of them by hand. There's the first one. Now the only two that are left are the ones that hold on to the sprocket. This cover plate for the timing chain cover has a gasket, steel gasket. I use some RTV on the front and the back side of it, a very thin layer. If you don't have a new one, you can do this in a pinch to basically get the gasket sealed up again. So obviously make sure that this surface is clean, free of any oils, which it is. I'm going to go ahead and put this plate in here. I'm going to line it up with one of the bolts and start that one to make it stay in place. And then once that one's started, I'm going to start its second one so I can let go of it without it falling off. All right, now I'll start the other two. I'll bottom them out. I'll give the RTV a few minutes to dry, and then I'll torque it to 89 inch-pounds as well. Now let's torque this to 89 inch-pounds. That's 1. I'm going to go in a cross pattern, that way the gasket can seat properly. 2. 3. 4. Now let's take the crossover tube and slide it into the water pump. This tube might have to spin a little bit to clear the exhaust, and once it's lined up, wiggle it and press it in, but make sure you press it in enough. It has to go in all the way, and sometimes it's a little difficult for the gasket to slide in, but you have to just kind of work with it and press it, wiggle it until it lines up. At the same time, the way to check this is to line up the thermostat housing. Okay, let's start putting the thermostat housing bolts back in. I'm going to try and line this one up first. I'm going to start it in a few threads. That way I know it's not going to come back off. Next I'm going to get the bottom one lined up, which is right over here. Okay, that one I think is starting. I'm going to drive it in with my ratchet a few turns. I'll put a rag, or put a piece of rag between the bolt and the socket. That'll hold it in for me so I can get it lined up with the hole. Alright, I can't get a torque wrench in here, so I'm just going to make these snug. The torque is also 89 inch-pounds, so that's not a lot. Just make it nice and tight with the 1/4 inch ratchet. There we go. All right, last one. Perfect. Let's put the temperature sensor back in. I put some thread sealer or thread tape on there. It's important to do that. You don't want coolant leaks. And I'm gonna thread it on by hand as far as I can. Then I'm gonna take my 19mm socket, drive it all the way in. And you can see it has this gasket here, that copper gasket. Basically that has to bottom out up against the thermostat housing and seal up. Other than the thread sealer, that gasket is what makes the seal. Okay, that's bottomed out. I'm gonna give it a little extra. Don't go crazy tight on this because you're threading it into aluminum and you don't want to strip or break the sensor. But just give it a little snug, and then once that's done, let's go ahead and reconnect the electrical connector. Push it in until it clicks. Perfect. Now let's take the thermostat and slide it into its housing. There we go. Put it in there, make sure it's centered up. Take the other side of your housing, slide it over. Let's put the two bolts in. Let's put in the two 10mm bolts that secure the other half of this housing on. I think it just did. And that's tight. All right, it's time to fill up the cooling system. I have a spill-free funnel here. Basically, this serves two purposes. One, it helps me not spill. And two, it makes this the highest point in the cooling system. So naturally, the air is gonna wanna come up and out through the funnel as opposed to getting trapped inside the reservoir or further down the line. I'm gonna put in some coolant. You can refer to your owner's manual if you're not sure what to use. And I'm gonna fill it up until the funnel has a little bit of coolant in it. So I'm gonna fill up the reservoir basically more than it actually has to be full. And then I'm gonna leave some coolant up here. That way the air can, like I said, naturally bleed out. Now once it is full, I'm gonna go ahead and start the vehicle, let the engine run. Make sure the heat is on in the car. Put the temperature all the way up. That way the heater core can circulate the coolant and push any air out. And put the blower on low. That way it doesn't cool the car down, but you wanna feel when the heat comes through. And then just wait until the cooling fan comes on, and then until the car reaches operating temperature, at which point you can shut it off and let it cool down with this still attached. Afterwards, you wanna adjust the level. So if it's still over full, remove some. And if it's not full enough, just bring it up to the full line, and then you can remove it and cap this off. Now let's put the cap back on. Make sure it's nice and snug. Take it for a road test.